As I'm sure many people would know, last month marked the 40th anniversary of Australia's Racial Discrimination Act, and today we're joined by Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner, Dr. Soutphommasane, to reflect on how effective the legislation has been in dealing with racism and discrimination over the past 4 decades, to reflect on the sorts of issues that we face as a society today, and also to reflect on the sorts of challenges he sees that may well lie ahead. Would you please welcome our guest, Dr. Soutphommasane.
Well, thank you very much, Laurie. I'm delighted to be here at the National Press Club. Many of us will be familiar in some way or another with the following scenario. There's a passenger on a train who's launched into a racial tirade against another passenger. Some in the carriage pause to watch the scene unfold. Others avert their gaze. There's an air of nervous discomfort. Now, this genre of racism has become more prominent in recent years. At least media appear to be reporting it with increasing frequency. But increasingly, it seems the case that people are standing up and speaking back against bigotry. In April, for example, on a Sydney train, a young woman witnessed a fellow passenger abusing a Muslim husband and wife. The young woman confronted the abuse. She uploaded footage of the incident onto social media. A few weeks later, in May, on a train in Melbourne, a young man saw a group of tradesmen vilifying 3 women wearing Islamic headscarves. The young man intervened. He was assaulted, punched in the face. But when asked whether he would do it again, the young man said he would only change one thing, that he had said something sooner. The stories of this young woman, Stacey Clark, and this young man, Jason Cias, are signs that a generational change is happening on matters of race. And I begin with the stories of Stacey and Jason because this year we reflect on the changes in our race relations that have occurred over the generations. It was 40 years ago that the Commonwealth Parliament passed the Racial Discrimination Act, Australia's first federal human rights legislation. And as we mark the Act's anniversary, it seems only appropriate for us to ask, how far have we come on matters of race? How much farther do we have to go? What should be the role of the law in shaping attitudes and conduct? And might it be time for our Constitution to prohibit rather than permit racial discrimination? As with so much of our democratic history, the story of the Racial Discrimination Act was not a revolutionary one. Unlike America, where a long civil rights struggle culminated in the Civil Rights Act, culminated in a nation believing that it could fulfill a certain dream, the Racial Discrimination Act wasn't the product of protest, nor did it inspire grand visions of a society reversing injustice. Thus, on the occasion of the Act coming into effect in 1975, Gough Whitlam conceded that the legislation lacked the rhetorical grandeur of American documents. Even so, Whitlam hoped that it would entrench new attitudes of tolerance and understanding in the hearts and minds of the people. He hoped that it would have compelling and lasting force. Few would dispute that it has had such force. The Racial Discrimination Act was a landmark achievement. Its effect was to be profound. For the first time, Australians had an official statement that discrimination wasn't to be tolerated. For the first time, people could seek a legal remedy for being wronged. For the first time, those who were denied a job or turned away from being served because of their race could say, "The law is on my side. It's true that the Racial Discrimination Act was enacted with bipartisan support from the Parliament in 1975, but this didn't mean that it enjoyed an easy birth. Far from it. There was stiff resistance. One senator argued that the law would create, and I quote, an official race relations industry with a staff of dedicated anti-racists that would be intent on persecuting white Australians. Others argued that the law would exacerbate the tensions which the law was expressly designed to avoid. Such predictions haven't come to pass. For the Racial Discrimination Act has been an instrument not of persecution, but of protection. It has promoted racial harmony rather than undermine it. The Act has formed, if you will, the legislative backbone of Australian multiculturalism, a multiculturalism admired around the world and endorsed by Australian society. Yes, from time to time, some will decry multiculturalism's supposed failure, but there's very little evidence for such failure. Ours is a society where the children of migrants, on average, outperform the children of native-born Australians when it comes to education and employment. Ours is a society where immigrants are eager and are encouraged to become citizens and claim their place as an equal among us. It speaks volumes that 85% of people, 85%, believe that multiculturalism is good for the country. Contrary to what the likes of Dawn Fraser might say, most Australians do not tell migrants and their children to go back to where they came from. And our multicultural success hasn't been the result of fortune, it's been the result of design. This is because our multiculturalism has been based on the contract of citizenship. And the contract says this: every Australian should be able to feel relaxed and comfortable in their own skin, whatever the colour may be. But every Australian also has certain responsibilities. Our multiculturalism has always been based on civic expectations. As it's contained in the Citizenship pledge taken by every new Australian, every member of our society should share our democratic beliefs, respect our liberties, abide by our laws, be loyal to this country and its people. There is, of course, ongoing debate about our current citizenship laws. The federal government a few weeks ago released a discussion paper about citizenship. The paper explored possible new powers to strip citizenship from people who engage in terrorism-related activities. And through the Australian Citizenship Amendment Allegiance to Australia Bill, the federal government is also proposing to expand the provisions for the automatic revocation of citizenship, namely for dual citizens who act contrary to an allegiance to Australia. The Act already, of course, provides for the revocation of citizenship from dual nationals who serve in the armed forces of a country at war with Australia. It may be reasonable, in my view, for citizenship also to be revoked from dual citizens who engage in terrorism, so long as adequate due process safeguards are in place. But we must be cautious about making any dramatic changes to our citizenship regime. Any change should be the subject of careful deliberation. If people are to be exiled or banished from the Australian community, it must only be because of the gravest conduct and only in the most exceptional circumstances. It should not be done through the exercise of a power held by a minister. As a general principle, let us be clear about one thing. Citizenship is the keystone of our national unity. the formal statement of our national identity. While we must respond to threats to national security, we should be careful not to create social division. We should be careful not to make people feel that their standing as citizens is vulnerable. We should remember that civic security strengthens our national security. And in more general terms, our debate must also answer some fundamental questions about the meaning of allegiance. Can people still express dissent as part of their citizenship? When might patriotism be used to justify an unwarranted intrusion into the rights of citizenship? I ask these questions because I believe patriotic citizenship must leave room for debate and disagreement. There must be room for robust expressions of opinion. Because there will be times when patriotic citizenship demands that we be critical of our country or of our government. That oft-invoked phrase, "my country, right or wrong," may come to mind. But it should be this: my country, right or wrong, if right, to be kept right, and if wrong, to be set right. On matters of race, there remain many things to be set right. It's simply not good enough that close to 1 in 5 Australians say they have experienced racial or religious discrimination during the past 12 months. Prejudice and discrimination are blights on the lives of far too many Australians. They blight our neighbourhoods, our shopping centres, our workplaces, everyday places where people go about their everyday business. Some groups encounter more racism than others. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience it in the most systemic form. We see this in the alarming rise in incarceration rates and in the marked inequalities in health, education and employment. We know as well that racism particularly affects those from non-European backgrounds. Research shows that when it comes to applying for a job, it helps to be called Wilson rather than Wang, or Morris rather than Muhammad. And whether it is in corporate boardrooms or on the floor of our parliaments across the country, there is a relative absence of leaders from non-European backgrounds. Such lack of representation prompts us to ask one question: might there be limits to our embrace of cultural diversity? There are as well emerging threats to our social cohesion. I hold serious concerns about a deterioration of community harmony, a deterioration that warrants close attention from governments and leaders. Anxieties about the threat of Islamist extremism have fed a rise in the harassment of Muslim and Arab Australians, many of whom feel under constant suspicion. There's been a marked increase as well in reports of anti-Semitism, part of a global resurgence in anti-Jewish feeling. There are signs of rising anti-Chinese sentiment, increasingly expressed in the realm of heated property markets in Sydney and Melbourne. And organised racist movements, having been for some time in retreat, appear to be revitalised. The internet has made it easy for fringe dwellers to spread messages of hatred and division and to find willing audiences lurking online. It's a challenging environment. But amid all this, the Racial Discrimination Act has only gained in importance. It stands to remind people that their country will protect them from discrimination and vilification, that their country will guarantee that freedom is not a privilege of the powerful, but something to be enjoyed by all. This effect of the Act is both symbolic and practical. but it comes down to the educative nature of the legislation. Earlier this year, at a conference I convened in Sydney, Governor-General Sir Peter Cosgrove described the Racial Discrimination Act the following way. It was a crucial enabler that speaks in tones of empowerment, not reprimand, one that seeks to educate and unite. Despite what some commentators might say, you can't be prosecuted or convicted under the Racial Discrimination Act. Complaints about racial discrimination and vilification are conciliated. It's only when conciliation fails that a matter may be taken to court. Since 1975, there have been more than 6,000 complaints successfully conciliated under the Act. That's more than 6,000 occasions when people have been able to talk through their conflict without resorting to the courts. Only very rarely do complaints, in fact, end up in litigation. For example, during the last financial year, 2014-15, just 3% of complaints concerning racial discrimination proceeded to a federal court. 3%. Now, we all know there's been extensive debate about the Racial Discrimination Act during the past 18 months. Like many, I welcomed the federal government's decision not to proceed with repealing the Act's racial vilification provisions under 18C, Section 18C. As things stand, the law strikes a balance between freedom of speech and freedom from racial vilification. Section 18C does make it unlawful to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate another person because of their race. But through Section 18D, the Act also protects anything that's done reasonably and in good faith. That's artistic work, scientific inquiry, or fair comment and reporting on a matter of public interest. Repealing Section 18C would have sent a very dangerous signal. It would have given licence to prejudice and bigotry, to the idea that you can vilify others without any consequences, that you can have freedom without responsibility. And the many communities that spoke out in defence of the Act, Indigenous, Jewish, Muslim, Arab, Chinese, Vietnamese, Indian, Greek, Armenian, to name but a few, share these concerns. The vast majority of Australians share these concerns. Last April, a Fairfax Nielsen poll showed that 88% of people believed it should remain unlawful to offend, insult, or humiliate someone because of their race. All this should serve as a reality check for all those who continue to advocate for a watering down of the Racial Discrimination Act. If we take a sober look at the debate over the last 18 months or so about Section 18C, we see this. Supporting the rights of bigots is a fringe minority cause rejected by the overwhelming majority of Australians. The overwhelming majority of Australians accept that the law should reflect our values of civility and tolerance. The overwhelming majority of Australians accept we should hold people to account for racial vilification. To be sure, some libertarians, or so-called classical liberals, argue that the best antidote for racist speech should be more speech. These voices say we should respond to racial vilification only through debate and criticism. We should welcome flushing out racism into the open, rather than letting legislative prohibitions push it underground. Now, one's position on all this matters, namely one's social position matters. Someone who's never experienced racial discrimination may well benefit from being an observer, seeing hatred exposed for the first time. They may well benefit from having for the first time to speak out against racism, to articulate why it's unacceptable. But it's different for those who are on the receiving end of racism. I have not yet encountered anyone who has experienced racism tell me that they're grateful for having bigotry or discrimination brought out into the open. No one has ever said to me that they're grateful for having been abused as a coon or a gook or a sand nigger. As for good speech overcoming bad speech, not everyone may have the power to speak back. One of the effects of racial vilification is precisely that it silences its targets and prevents them from speaking back. In any case, the law can play a role in facilitating debate and discussion. Recently, I read the story of Daryl Davis, an African-American musician. In 1983, at a gig in Maryland, a member of the audience offered to buy Davis a drink. The man was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. The man told Davis that it was the first time he'd ever spoken to a black man. What happened? Well, Davis befriended this member of the Klan, and he decided to befriend many other Klan members as well. He invited Klan members to his gigs, invited them into his own home. Davis believed in challenging the beliefs and practices of the Ku Klux Klan, not through confrontation or even argument, but by patiently listening to Klan members, by gently persuading them to change their ways. And strangely enough, in Davis's case, it worked. Over some 2 decades, he managed to talk more than a dozen men to quit the Ku Klux Klan. Today, Davis has in his home a prized collection of old Klan robes given to him by a reformed Klansman. It's a fascinating story. For the libertarian, however, this may be regarded as proof that we don't need legislation in order to achieve social change. But I think it seems rather odd to rely on such an unusual example as Davis to make that case. There aren't many African Americans who would befriend Ku Klux Klansmen. I imagine there wouldn't be many Asian or Muslim Australians out there befriending neo-Nazis either. To expect that there must would involve an unjust division of labour. It would amount to saying that the responsibility for combating racism must ultimately lie with the victims of racism. Which brings me back to the role and effect of legislation. We shouldn't rely on zealous heroism as our only weapon against bigotry. Having laws against racism in place allows for the kind of conversations that Davis had with his Klansman friend to happen at the level of society. It ensures that the responsibility of social change becomes a collective one. It educates people en masse rather than just one person at a time. It's foundational in educating not only our personal sensibilities, but also our deepest civic sentiments as citizens. In fighting racism, we needn't choose either a legislative response or one based in civil society. If we're to be effective, we must do both. And that's why much of the work that I do at the Australian Human Rights Commission is centred on the National Anti-Racism Strategy. Since 2012, through the strategy, we've educated people about how to prevent and reduce racism. We've developed curriculum material for teachers to use in history and physical education classes in primary and high schools. We've helped 140 organisations to diagnose how well they are taking advantage of cultural diversity through a cultural diversity workplace tool that was the first of its kind. Last month, we launched a new resource for local governments to guide them on how they can build social cohesion. But civil society features prominently in all this. Through the Racism It Stops With Me campaign, we called upon organisations across the country to take a stand against prejudice and discrimination. And so far, more than 360 organisations have joined as supporters, spanning business, sport, government, education, the not-for-profit sector. Today I'm happy to announce details of the second phase of the National Anti-Racism Strategy. The second phase will begin this month and will be based on two themes. One, supporting diversity and inclusion, and two, combating prejudice and discrimination. These themes reflect the need not only for us to respond to racism, but also our responsibility to cultivate social cohesion. In supporting diversity and inclusion, the strategy will work closely with those in corporate Australia who are embracing cultural diversity. And this afternoon, I welcome Westpac as a new supporter to the Racism It Stops With Me campaign. In recent months, I've had the opportunity to work with CEO Brian Hartzer and Westpac's leadership, for instance, supporting their new focus on Asian leadership in the firm. Westpac is also joining the University of Sydney Business School and PwC as part of an expert working group I've convened to develop a blueprint for cultural diversity and leadership in corporate Australia. In the area of sport, the Australian Human Rights Commission has renewed its partnership with the National Rugby League. On the eve of State of Origin, I had to mention that. But we'll be helping the NRL to develop its policies on social inclusion and cultural diversity. And in our work combating prejudice and discrimination, we will continue to take the fight online. That's where the new battleground for racism lies. We'll be working with Twitter to empower people to counter hate speech and prevent it from gaining a new digital foothold. We're grateful as well to have the ongoing support of Adam Goods as our Racism It Stops With Me ambassador. In speaking up so powerfully and eloquently against racism, Adam has started many new conversations and challenged many old attitudes. It is in no small part due to Adam that we are increasingly seeing spectators at sporting matches report racial abuse to authorities. A cultural change is happening. And the change is also happening outside sport. People in their everyday lives are standing up, as in the cases of people like Stacey Clark and Jason Cias, whom I mentioned at the start of my remarks. I'm delighted, in fact, to have Stacey and Jason here today in our audience, because it's people like Stacey and Jason who embody the citizenship that we need in our society. As citizens, they were prepared to stand up for others, to stand up for decency, fairness and equality. And it's men and women like them who should inspire all of us to respond with courage when we are confronted by racism. Their examples remind us what citizenship really is all about. Let me conclude on the note of patriotic citizenship. Any patriotism should be about improving one's country. If you love your country, you should want to make it better. On matters of race, for all of the successful incorporation of immigrants into Australian society, for all the triumph, if you will, of multicultural nation building, there has been one lingering shortcoming. Australian nationhood has always, as some have put it, been defined by a great silence about Indigenous people. A cult of forgetfulness practiced on a national scale. There's one obvious opportunity for us to do better: the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution. Such recognition would redress one of the moral deficiencies of the Constitution. In its current form, as we know, the document says nothing about Indigenous people as the first Australians. Furthermore, the Constitution contains 2 sections which permit racial discrimination. These aspects of the Constitution reflect its history. They reflect a different time, a time when our first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, could say that Australians didn't believe that the doctrine of the equality of man was really ever intended to include racial equality. But constitutions shouldn't exist as historical artefacts or relics. They should exist as living documents. And today we have an opportunity to right old wrongs. We have an opportunity to make a statement about racial equality. And it's time that our Constitution is purged of ideas about racial superiority and the natural order of imperial power. It's time that we also guarantee that all Australians have a protection from racial discrimination. Because our Constitution should and must speak more truly in the spirit of our democracy. One committed to equal citizenship and to the rejection of racism.
Positive reaction to your speech, Dr. Soutphommasane, obviously. Let me ask the first question. You alluded to this in your address, but as I recall, the first time I can recall you writing about the fact this threat to, if you like, community harmony through anti-Muslim bigotry. Can we assume that it has worsened, and to what extent in that, I read this last October, I think, in the intervening period? How concerned are you about that? And as an extension of that question, you also referred to, I'm not sure you use these terms, but again, you've written about this, the rise in organised extremist racism, or racist extremism, I think is the term you used. How much of it, through the use of the internet, how much of a threat do you see that being?
Well, thank you, Laurie. The communities that I speak to regularly, including those from Muslim and Arab backgrounds, certainly say to me that the situation has worsened. This isn't always going to be reflected in statistics. It's not always going to be reflected, for example, in the amount of incidents that have been reported, whether that's in the form of reports to police or whether that's in increased numbers of complaints concerning racial discrimination or vilification to the Human Rights Commission, but the mood appears to have deteriorated. I've always been firmly of the view that we are best placed to combat any threat to our national security through national unity, not through division. What we have to avoid is tarring entire communities with the brush of prejudice. And last year, when the official terror alert was raised to high, and when the language of Team Australia was introduced to our political lexicon, I had many community organisations and members, particularly of Muslim and Arab background, express their concern. So perhaps the situation is at one level about mood and the atmospherics of our society, but that only underlines the importance of leadership on such matters. We've come too far to be complacent or glib about social cohesion or community harmony. And we are seeing some disturbing signs of people being emboldened to express their extremist views. As I mentioned in my remarks, not long ago, extremist movements or organisations were operating underground, but very rarely did they ever put their heads above the parapet. But now we have marches in the name of reclaiming Australia. We have greater activity online, fed by social media. Anonymity online also gives fuel to this phenomenon. So I think at that level as well, we are seeing some signs of concern. But to answer your question, Laurie, I think it's in that mood that we have in our society, but also in the greater prominence of extremist organised movements that are making their presence felt.
And if I might just follow up, do you think that that in any way is contributing potentially to the minds of some young people who decide that they want to go off and fight for Islamic State, for instance, or do you think that's really unrelated?
It's a good question. The field of radicalisation is a relatively new one, but the research does underline the range of factors which contribute to people in liberal democratic societies being drawn to terrorist organisations like Islamic State or other extreme Islamist movements. As I said, we're much better placed to prevent this from happening if we have a society that is cohesive and harmonious, where people feel that they can belong to our society. Because if there is disillusion, disaffection, then that opens the door for extremist organisations to spout their propaganda. And we're finding increasingly that in the online sphere, this is being done with devastating effect for those young people who are disaffected and disillusioned and don't feel that they're welcome in Australia, or feel that they're under constant suspicion or pressure to demonstrate their national loyalty. We cannot, I repeat, be complacent about this, but our response must be grounded in social cohesion, not through finger pointing.
I'll take a question now from Brooke Boney.
Thank you for your speech, Dr. Soutphommasane. That was lovely. I'm Brooke Boney from SBS. It seems as though we are seeing more of these racist tirades in public places, and we're definitely seeing more people film them and upload them to the internet. Why do you think that is, firstly? And secondly, what would you recommend people do if they see these sorts of tirades? I mean, sometimes it means that they're then putting themselves in harm's way. So what would your recommendation be then?
Well, thank you, Brooke. There's no doubt in my mind that the media attention given to public incidents of racism is playing a positive role in all of this. 10, 20 years ago, to hear of a racist incident occurring in public would not have been deemed newsworthy. Now, part of this has to do with the fact that the ugliness of such incidents is being captured in motion picture. Perhaps for the first time, sections of our community are seeing what racism can look like in all of its devastating force. The examples that have been set by people who've gone beyond being bystanders to intervening has also been a factor in this. People now have a sense that they can do something in such situations. Quite often it can be a very intimidating situation. Now, I've been in this situation, I know many others will have been in this situation, and you really have only a split second to decide what you'll do. Are you going to step forward and intervene? What will be the consequences? And at the back of people's minds will be that fear that perhaps this might escalate, perhaps there will be a physical confrontation. Our advice at the Human Rights Commission is to encourage people to do what they can if it's safe to do so. We're certainly not encouraging people to throw themselves in harm's way. But the things that you can do is you can speak out, ask a question, make it clear that you don't approve of someone's conduct. You can also report an incident to a relevant authority. You can film an incident to ensure that there's a record of what had transpired. Perhaps most importantly, you can offer comfort or support to a target of abuse. The psychological research has shown that by remaining silent, people can give tacit endorsement to those who bully or harass or intimidate others. By remaining silent, we may well be complicit in such situations. So there's always something that people can do, and I'm encouraged to find, in fact, that organisations are now beginning to conduct work in training people on how they can respond in so-called bystander scenarios. For example, a number of local councils have in fact began to pilot programs where they're training members of the local community into knowing what to do in those situations. But I also just want to say one very quick thing about the everyday things that you can do. You don't need to be caught up in one of those archetypal situations on a train or on a bus. You can always start a conversation with a family member or a friend or a colleague at work around these matters, because it is about educating people, changing attitudes and conduct. And while conversations alone can't do the job, they can go some way to starting the journey of change.
Shalala Maduro.
Shalala Maduro from The Guardian. Thank you very much for your speech today. I just wanted to touch on an answer you gave to Laurie's question just now about the need for leadership. You yourself have raised concerns, and as have groups like ASPI, about the terminology used in political debates when it comes to de-radicalisation, things like stripping citizenship and all those kind of issues. How important is the political language that our leaders use in framing this debate, and do you think that we're going down a path here that is corrosive to cohesion?
Absolutely, there's an important need for political leadership. We should have a political debate that shouldn't shirk from important questions, not least concerning national security, but I'd hope that those debates can be conducted in a sober, deliberative manner, based on facts and involving political leaders who can bring the temperature down sometimes. We have a lot to be proud of in the Australian history of taking in migrants from all corners of the world and doing that with a non-discriminatory policy with immigration. But part of that inheritance involves vigilance and responsibility. We should not be recklessly doing anything to undermine our social cohesion and the historical tradition we have around nation building, immigration and integration. So in short, political leadership is paramount in all this, and as I consistently, as I make the point consistently through public statements, it's very important that political leadership consider the language it uses. We certainly don't want to see groups in our society feeling as though they're being unfairly targeted or being made the subjects of undue suspicion. Citizens, our fellow citizens, should ordinarily enjoy the benefit of the doubt. That is part of what membership in a society means, and I would hope that we live up to those standards rather than contravening those standards.
Sabra Lane.
Commissioner Sabra Lane from the ABC. You talked about the terminology Team Australia in your speech. The Prime Minister often used that phrase at the start of this year. What would you advise him to use instead, given the feedback that you've heard from a broad cross-section of the society?
Thanks for your question, Sabra. And my answer is based on the views that have been expressed to me by various communities, particularly Muslim and Arab communities, since last year. And they have said to me that they believe the language of Team Australia may not always be helpful in cultivating social cohesion and community harmony. Much depends on what one means by Team Australia. If Team Australia is just shorthand for an Australian liberal democratic society, one defined by parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, equality of the sexes, I don't think anyone could object to Team Australia. But there is a perception among some communities that the language of Team Australia means something else. So if the language of Team Australia is going to be used, it's incumbent on those using the language to flesh out its meaning, to explain what it means, to reassure people that we're not talking about the creation of a new team here, but about an existing team, one that already exists, one that coincides with the liberal democratic community we have, which welcomes people of diverse ethnic, cultural and religious backgrounds. So I think it's really not so much about the language of Team Australia per se alone, but it's about the nuances which come with the use of such phrases. And there is, I believe, a need for reassurance at what is a very testing time.
Joe Kelly.
Joe Kelly with the Australian Dr. Soutphommasane. You mentioned the Indigenous recognition campaign at the end of your speech. I just wanted to ask you what you think the chances of a broad constitutional guarantee are of succeeding at a referendum if, as proposed by the Joint Select Committee, it proposes a ban on discrimination on grounds of race, colour or ethnic or national origin. And secondly, do you consider that such a guarantee might be used to challenge and overturn practices like vote turnbacks or other government policies in the High Court?
Thanks, Joe. The Joint Select Committee canvassed three options for changing the Constitution. One of them involved the recommendation of a non-discrimination clause along the lines recommended by the expert panel on constitutional recognition a number of years ago, namely Section 116A. But there were two other options which were canvassed by the Select Joint Committee which did not go as far as that particular recommendation. The sentiment that I've picked up from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples has been that any constitutional recognition should be of a substantive nature. That's supported by the consultations that the expert panel did a number of years ago. It's borne out by the Joint Select Committee's report, which was recently released too. And I'm advised that this is also a somewhat accurate summation of the sentiments expressed yesterday at the summit hosted by the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. Of course, there is a need to debate whether we need to have non-discrimination as part of a constitutional recognition package. My view is that ideally there should be attention paid to non-discrimination, because if we're talking about the history of the Constitution, its silence about Indigenous peoples, we're talking about a document which actively empowers the Commonwealth and states to engage in discrimination based on race. I understand there are concerns about a non-discrimination clause in the Constitution, but if we are a society that's committed to equality and to combating racial discrimination, I think the onus is on those expressing concerns or reservations to elaborate or explain fully what the concerns are. Now, you've touched on some of that, Joe, in raising the possibility that a non-discrimination clause may limit the power of governments to legislate across a number of areas. Or if it's a limit on the ability of governments to discriminate on the basis of race, I would see nothing objectionable in that. We should note that the constitutions of many liberal democracies, including those who share histories in the English common law, have constitutional clauses on racial non-discrimination. Canada has it in its Charter of Rights and Freedoms. New Zealand has it in its Bill of Rights Act. South Africa has it in its constitution. So I would just urge there to be a sober and calm deliberation about what a non-discrimination clause would involve. I certainly would think that there'd be a great deal of public support for a statement about non-discrimination of some kind in the Australian Constitution. But let's have an open debate about this. There's no need for us to close down the discussion or to dismiss options at this stage. At this stage, where we haven't got a model in front of us yet, let's have a reasoned and reasonable debate about what recognition should involve. But the response that I've heard from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples has been pretty emphatic on this point, and we should not be dismissing those concerns lightly.
Jane Lee.
Jane Lee from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, Commissioner. You spoke earlier of the importance of citizenship, and you also mentioned that the majority of Australians now accept that the Racial Discrimination Act should hold people to account for bigotry. A recent Fairfax Ipsos poll also showed that the majority of voters, 75%, support a proposal floated by the Coalition to strip sole Australian nationals who take part in terrorist acts if they're able to obtain citizenship of another country. What do you think this reflects about Australians' current attitudes towards racial discrimination and citizenship and its connection to that?
I would say that the sentiment is really one concerned with citizenship. Now, we don't have a political tradition in this country of talking about citizenship. Citizenship is a category that didn't exist until 1948. Up until that time, members of Australian society were subjects. We were subjects of the British Crown. So we're talking here about a legal and political status that is still relatively immature, if you like, in our broader sweep of history. And I think the concern, or the sentiment of 75% agreeing with the stripping of citizenship, I would read as a reflection of community concern about national security and community acceptance that citizenship carries with it certain responsibilities, not least an allegiance to Australia, a loyalty to this country and its people. Now, whether or not those who act contrary to that allegiance should be stripped of citizenship is another matter. And I know that, and here the conversation gets a bit complicated because there are really two respects in which the conversation about citizenship is occurring at the moment. One is through the discussion paper that the federal government released in May, which, among other things, canvassed the possibility of having the Minister for Immigration having a power to strip citizenship from people who may be eligible for citizenship in another country, so not necessarily dual citizens. And secondly, we're talking also in the context of deliberation about the Australian Citizenship Amendment Allegiance to Australia Bill, which is directed at dual nationals and stripping citizenship from dual nationals who may engage in terrorism-related activity or other offences as defined in the criminal code. As I said in my remarks, we should be very cautious about doing anything which involves the stripping of citizenship from Australian nationals, whether they're dual nationals or whether they only hold Australian citizenship. If there is to be the revocation or cessation of citizenship for nationals who engage in terrorism-related activity, it must only concern the gravest conduct, and it must be accompanied by proper due process safeguards. As a general rule, provisions should only be enlivened when there is a conviction for criminal terrorist conduct, and we should have a process that reflects criminal standards when it comes to the burden of proof, among other things. But these are very complex issues which the current debate raises. I would read, though, the sentiment reported in today's newspapers as a reflection of concern that people have about national security and a certain understanding of the responsibilities that come with citizenship, which aren't necessarily an endorsement of a more complex view of what citizenship and its revocation should involve.
Michael Keating.
Commissioner Michael Keating from Keating Media. In your report, you've outlined 3 objectives for the Racism It Stops With Me campaign to ensure more Australians recognise that racism is unacceptable, create tools to deal with it, and empower individuals and organisations to respond effectively to it. What do you think politically there is left to do to achieve those objectives?
we need to educate people on an ongoing basis about the harms of racism and what they can do. Through the work that we do on the National Anti-Racism Strategy, we've identified a number of areas that we believe warrant closer attention or more work. That includes in education and in schools. It includes employment and the workplace. It includes the online sphere, government service provision. I actually think there's a lot more that can be done in combating systemic or structural forms of racism, which are quite insidious, sometimes difficult to identify or diagnose. And I think if there is to be work in the realm of government, perhaps there can be greater coordinated efforts in that area. But if we're talking about political work that has to be done, I revert to my answers earlier, which are about leadership, about setting the right tone for society, ensuring that we don't undermine our social cohesion at a time of anxiety about national security, because our civic security is something that strengthens our national security rather than detract from it.
Roger Houseman.
Roger Houseman for Inside Canberra. One of the questions that regularly gets asked from visitors to Australia is what makes Australian multiculturalism generally successful, and why is it different from other parts of the world? And in that respect, when we discuss racism and reverse racism, there seems to be at times a lack of discussion as to what the actual advantages of differentiation are. And you mentioned the NRL. There certainly seems to be a lot of islanders playing in the NRL with great success. Now, is that being positioned as a positive for our society? And how can we find other examples within our civic environment where, you know, examples like that exist but are not necessarily seen as a positive?
Well, thank you for your question, Roger. Why is Australian multiculturalism successful? It's bound up in the history that we've had in nation building and in conducting mass immigration following the end of the Second World War. We've always had a very well-articulated immigration program in this country. In the early stages of the post-war migration program, of course, it was encapsulated by the idea of populate or perish. Later on, it developed to assume other forms, but there's always been a high level of public acceptance of the importance of immigration to strengthen Australia, to improve Australia. In addition to that, governments have been very active in having settlement and multicultural policies which support new arrivals to this country. I remember when I spent years in England and talked to people about multicultural policies and explained to them the muscular, practical nature of Australian multiculturalism, the fact that you had historically migrant resource centres which taught new arrivals about how to get a Medicare card, how to enrol their child in school, how things were done in the neighbourhood. They were completely unfamiliar with such practices, which goes to show that we shouldn't take all of the things that we've done in the past 4 or 5 or 6 decades for granted. Not every country has embarked on an explicit multicultural project as we have. I think as well, having a migration policy that has been one that has emphasised skilled workers and English proficiency has been to Australia's advantage. But I wouldn't discount in all this the role that anti-discrimination legislation and political leadership have had in the success of our multiculturalism. Having a country where leaders, for the most part, welcome new arrivals and refrain from telling migrants and their children to go back to where they came from is a good thing. And it makes a world of difference for those who come here to start a new life to know that they're being welcomed into the family of the nation.
We often have young student leaders in our audience. We're joined by one today, Dominic Nguyen from Radford College here in the ACT.
Dominic Nguyen from Radford College, Canberra. Thank you very much for your speech, Commissioner. The South African writer Nadine Gordimer, a prominent critic of apartheid, espoused the belief that the racist system can only be dealt with radically and with uncompromising passion and seriousness. Indeed, she labelled herself a radical. By adopting this attitude, many South Africans were able to take a large step towards justice and the removal of mandated racism in their own country. While it is clear that racism in our own country is nowhere near the extent in South Africa, discreetly it still exists. As you rightly described in your article, How to Best Tackle Racism Australian Style for the Age, systemic racism still manages to manifest itself in even simple things such as jovial and friendly conversation between friends, something that I myself have experienced from time to time. Yet when it is called out for what it is, there's still a chance of being, described as being a sensitive Sally. The response that I often get is, come on, mate, it was just a joke. My question, therefore, is how can we encourage the wider Australian society to be more involved and invested, passionate about, discussing and dealing with racism in all its forms, whether jovial or intentionally pernicious, and not shying away from it for the years to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dominic. What a great question. Long may we have young radicals at the National Press Club.
Radicals at Bradford, that's right.
How do we have a conversation about race? And you're absolutely right, Dominic, to highlight the defensiveness that often accompanies any raising of race. People will have that refrain. I'm only joking, or I'm not racist, but... and I think that goes to the attitudinal changes that are necessary if we're to have more lasting changes in our society. This is not unconnected with the structural and systemic forms of discrimination we have. Martin Luther King Jr. referred to the soft bigotry of low expectations. They often exist in the germs of humour and jokes and take on a different life. They can escalate into something more. For me, one way of doing the work is to make a distinction between intention and impact. One of the reasons people get their tails up when you challenge them about racism is they would quickly conclude that you are making a wholesale judgment about their character. If you're calling someone a racist, the implication is that they're a bad person, that they're immoral in some way, that they're beyond the pale of decent society. Another way of looking at this is to look at the impact of behaviour, attitudes and conduct. And I don't think that you need to have malicious intention or to be a card-carrying member of a racist organisation to do or to say something that may have the effect of discriminating against another, belittling another, humiliating another. And if we can get people to think about the impact of their behaviour, then perhaps that's a better way to start the conversation, because it shows that racism isn't always born of hatred or fear. It can sometimes be born of ignorance or arrogance. So I would hope that that is one way of tackling the problem. Maybe it's not radical enough, Dominic, but sometimes the most radical acts in our lives are in the small conversations that we have. Never underestimate the powerful dignity of changing someone's view, to get them to step into the shoes of others, to empathise, or even to reflect on their own power and privilege. I think that's the challenge for our younger generations today. And Dominic, it's good to see you leading the way. And if there's anything I can do for you, you just let me know. He's going a long way, clearly.
We're not quite finished there, so I'll take one further question from Peter Phillips.
Dr. Soutphommasane, Peter Phillips, one of the directors of the National Press Club. Heartfelt thanks to you for speaking here today. It's wonderful to welcome you. I want to take you to a different area of your address of questions which have come to you, and that is an area which looks into the future somewhat. If we regard much of what's characterised Australia the last century as involving a certain cyclicality in moves relating to changes in the structure of our community, challenges inherent in some of those changes a century ago, sectarian difference between Catholic and Protestant, the Irish question, past the Second World War and into the influx of refugees, the refos from Eastern and Southern Europe, moving right along to post the Second World War and post the Vietnam conflict, the influx of post-Vietnam War generation, to the present, where again we are living with the jagged edges of difficulty of adjustment to, difficulty of social and policy adjustment to Islam and interpretation and understanding thereof. So in two parts. One, how do you see, perhaps in the near term, medium term, resolution of the issue of our engagement of and assimilation of Islam into Australian community? And in the slightly longer term, as we go along the path of cyclicality, what do you see as perhaps being the next cycle, and will we have learned enough to handle the next cycle better than we're handling the present one?
Well, thank you, Peter. It's a complex question that set of questions that you put to me. One is the assumption that history does indeed ebb and flow and go in cycles. I detect here some Toynbee from you, Peter. Others might prefer a different view, of maybe a Whiggish view of history as one of progress. I think the jury is still out on whether it's a case of cycles or progress, Peter. What I do want to say is this. I think if we are talking about Australia's future, it's often said that we will have a post-racial Australia, that in the future people will not see race. And I think that's a very optimistic view. I think history demonstrates to us that differences of some kind will endure in how we understand different cultures and ethnicities, and therefore the task of having an inclusive Australia can never be regarded as over. As to the engagement with Islam, that's a very big question, a very big question, and probably beyond my humble bounds as Race Discrimination Commissioner. But I do think that we need to ensure that we judge or regard our fellow Australians who may be of the Muslim faith as fellow citizens. We have many great examples of Australians of Muslim background who are examples of what good citizenship can involve. Let's not judge people of faith by the actions of a fanatical few. No one, for example, judges Christianity based on the actions of the Ku Klux Klan. We should not be judging Islam as a religion based on the adherence of a particular extremist interpretation of the faith. Some would say that it's about the political appropriation of the faith as opposed to a faithful interpretation of the religion. So in engaging with Islam, I can only hope that we have dialogue, that we have respect, and that we seek to learn about other traditions when we do have those conversations. And Australia is in a very, if you want to take a big picture of things, Peter, I think Australia is in a very interesting place to do these conversations within the Asia Pacific. Indonesia is one of our biggest neighbours, our biggest neighbour, and that is a country which has had an impressive record of when it comes to what it's achieved in recent years. A moderate, if I can use that phrase, Muslim population. I can only hope that we can put things into a context and have that mature engagement with faith, religion, and those bigger civilizational questions which you raise and which I'm woefully inadequate to answer, Peter.
Well, perhaps that's not an appropriate point to finish, but we will finish. Soutphommasane, thank you very much for your time today. Obviously, a very responsive audience here in the room. We never send our our guests away empty-handed. So it's a great pleasure of me to confer upon you membership of the Press Club, if of course you're willing to accept it, which I hope you are, and also a copy of our 50th anniversary book, Stand and Deliver. Many of the great speeches, the great speakers have appeared here over the last 50 years. The story behind those speeches, as well as elements of the speech themselves, you'll see front and centre on the front cover, the Dalai Lama, for instance. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.